So welcome everyone. My name is Dr Annie Bryant. I'm a clinical psychologist working in the Psychology in Schools team in the Norfolk and Suffolk Foundation Trust. And I'm joined today.
Hello, my name's Emily Skinner. I'm a highly specialist speech and language therapist working in West Suffolk Hospital, so covering the whole of the Suffolk County, mainly working with 4 to 11-year-olds on the social communication assessment pathway. And personally, I'm also a mother with an autistic 9-year-old, which I thought would be useful to share at the beginning. And she has very kindly consented to a few of her personal experiences, which are woven a little bit into our discussion today.
Great. Thanks, Emily. It's great to have you here. So today's workshop is on supporting language and communication. We have not run this workshop before and it is jam-packed full of content, so we will try and keep to our hour and a quarter, and I know we started a little bit late, so if you can't stick with us for the whole session, please don't worry, it is being recorded and it will go on to YouTube for you to watch back in your own time or to go back and look at things that maybe we've gone a bit quickly through, but do stick with us to the end if you can. That would be brilliant. Okay. So just to mention what we are and what we aren't covering today. So we're going to be talking about language, social communication, behaviour and emotions, masking, and then some advice on supporting language and social communication. Just to mention a bit about what we are not covering today, we have another workshop coming up in April, which is specifically on supporting neurodivergent children with social relationships, such as friendships. So we won't be covering that today. We have an existing workshop in our emotional wellbeing series, which has some advice on how parents can communicate with teenagers and how to kind of get what you want out of your conversations with teenagers. But that webinar is not specific for neurodivergent teenagers, but if you would find that advice helpful, we will put a link to the recording of that at the end of this workshop. And also just to mention that the majority of the content we're covering today is relevant to verbal children or children who have at least some level of verbal communication. So unfortunately, we're not going to be able to cover specific advice about how to support non-verbal children in today's workshop. And we're not able to talk to selective mutism either, but we do have some resources that we will signpost to at the end. Hopefully non-verbal children are already known to their local services, but if not and you would find that helpful, we will have some signposting at the end about how to access your local service for more specialist support. Okay, so just to start off, what does your child find difficult with communication or language, or both? And if anyone's just joined us and hasn't used Slido yet, Slido is our interaction tool for today. And you can join us on slido.com using the number code on the screen, or you can use the QR code to get directly into the questions and answers. Okay, so we've got expressing emotions coming up a lot already, yeah. Initiating conversations, speaking aloud in front of others. Using words. Talking to strangers, yeah, eye contact, remembering words, understanding and reading their and others' emotions, echolalia, yeah, mumbling. So we've got some things around the actual production of speech and language and some things around more of that social communication, answering questions, yeah. So we're getting some themes coming up along the top here. So we've got lots of people talking about emotions. So understanding and communicating emotions, using words, conversation. Yeah. Okay. So it's really interesting. Lots of stuff about emotions and feelings as well being linked to difficulties with communication and language. That's really helpful and definitely something we're going to spend time talking about today. Speaking out loud, yeah. Stammers, yeah, okay. The difference between a joke and a lie, yeah, okay. Being frustrated, yeah. Lots of these communication and language difficulties do sound really frustrating that you're talking through. Yeah, a lot of feeling of frustration and anger. Thank you so much, everyone. It's really, really helpful for us to get a sense of what your children are struggling with. Asking for help at school. Yeah, that's a really, really common one that we hear as well. Taking things really literally. Yeah, great. Thank you, everyone. That's really helpful. And I think we will speak to the vast majority of things that people have raised here we're going to cover today. So that's really helpful for us to know. Okay, so I'm going to hand over to Emily.
Right, we've added this communication triangle into the training as it's a really nice model to show the different areas that are involved in language and communication. If your child needs help with talking or communication at all, a speech and language therapist would often use this sort of model to assess and find out where the difficulty might be and to offer support. And then often the intervention will work through the different levels as one level supports the next level. So as you can see, you've got attention and listening being a really key communication foundation, and then this supports being able to play with others and socialize, and this all supports receptive language, which is the understanding of language, which then helps using language. And finally, the cherry on the cake is the speech sounds, and for all of these areas, there's also a developmental level. So for different age children, you'd expect different skills for all of these areas. A difficulty or a disruption with any of these levels can have a really big impact on a child's ability to communicate. And all those difficulties that you've just shared on Slido really shows how huge communication is, really, because it's so vast, the amount of areas that you might then have a difficulty with. So from there was lots of people saying about emotions and also literal and understanding difficulties. So those parents that shared that their children might not be able to understand what's a joke versus what's telling the truth, and that literal understanding would suggest a problem at that receptive level in the triangle. Other times we had a few people saying about speech sounds and mumbling, so that the top part of the triangle, that clarity of speech. And just to mention that often the neurodivergent children that we work with, it might be a lower level difficulty with understanding social rules, which then impacts speech sounds, which we'll go on to a little bit more, because it's that awareness of other people and the fact that your speech sounds aren't clear, which can then make communication tricky. And a few parents said about echolalia, which we don't talk about today, but that is just repeating back phrases. And I could do a whole training session on echolalia if we had time, but often children do this to help them process what's heard, and for lots of different reasons. So you might have children that have really good expressive use of language, but then when you look into it, a lot of it is showing possibly there's some understanding difficulties as well, because they're just repeating back things that they've heard, and it's almost hiding a difficulty. Okay, next slide, please. We've included some information here about questions and getting them right. This diagram, there's a lot of words on here, but it's based on an idea for questioning called blank levels. And blank levels was developed by a lady called Marion Blank, who looked at all the language and questions that teachers use in the classroom. And she found that there's different levels of questions, and she separated them into 1 to 4 here. And basic questions at the first level are simple, concrete information, such as what's this and where's that? Whereas the level 3 and 4 questions are asking for more abstract information. And this model is really interesting because it shows that there's a developmental level of learning these language and thinking skills, but for our neurodivergent children it doesn't always apply, so it's not as straightforward as moving up the levels, and you might find some children might not say an answer that you'd expect for a level 2 question, or they might have specific difficulties with level 3 questions, which look a lot at emotions and problem solving and thinking about others' perspectives, like what might happen next or how might she be feeling. And all this idea of sort of higher level understanding is often referred to as verbal reasoning. And for neurotypical children, about 65% of 5-year-olds are able to answer all these types of questions. And most of this higher level understanding development happens between about 4 to 7 years old. So the main thing to consider really is that neurodivergent children under 7 may find questions more difficult just because of their age anyway, but also because of their social communication differences. And just being aware that children over 7 and adults even who are neurodivergent may find that there's some times where verbal reasoning skills is just too much for them. And they might find that problem solving is too difficult, and sequencing and taking the next steps is just hard for another reason, such as lots of demands or a sensory reason or emotions overwhelming them at the time. I know when I talked to my daughter about this, she said she finds it really hard to answer questions at all, any questions at any level, if it involves a decision or an unknown. But she's very comfortable answering complex questions about a subject that she's really familiar with. And other times I would say she's a very organized and independent young girl, but then she can't do simple sequencing where she can't problem solve what the next thing to do is if she's tired or there's a sensory demand or something that she has to do that she knows she doesn't like to do, which is brushing her teeth at the moment. So yeah, it's just being aware that language can be quite a demand for a lot of the children that we work with, and just thinking about the types of demand we're putting on our children it's good to know a bit about verbal reasoning and these kind of questions. Right, next slide. So what is social communication? So we've put a few areas here and I'll just go through them quickly. So social communication is how a child uses communication in social situations. So this can basically mean all parts of communication. So it could be their voice, so their pitch, how loud or quiet they speak, how fast they speak, their speech rate. It could be their non-verbal signals, so using and understanding gestures and body language, turning to face the person who's talking to you, following a pointed finger, picking up on another person's facial expressions. Listening is also a really key part of social communication, because it's really key to be able to focus on what's important and needed to be listened to at the time. And similar to that is awareness of the listener needs. So being able to change how we're talking because of the listener's not prior knowledge. So I know a lot of the children I see will give me very complex terminology about an area that I don't know anything about because it's an interest to them. And it's that sort of checking back, that social communication skill of checking back. Oh, do you know what realms in Minecraft is? I'll go, no, I don't. Turn taking, so again, being able to wait for your turn in a conversation, not interrupting, and understanding and regulating emotions is really key for social communication, and lots of people commented on that. So I was really glad that people were aware of that And that's both recognizing your own and others' emotions too. And conversation skills. So starting a conversation, continuing a conversation, and ending a conversation. So social communication differences. The next slide, we've just wanted to stress really that there may be lots of reasons for social communication differences. It could be related to a diagnosis such as autism or ADHD, but it also could be another reason. Children can have a developmental language disorder with or without autism, and all of these different reasons could be why you might have social communication differences. And different difficulties with social communication often come from a lack of understanding from others and a pressure to be normal due to environments. And we just want to stress really that we don't want to change the way your child communicates, but instead offer advice and support on areas they find difficult, so that you hopefully come away with some tools and the best understanding and best advocate for your child's communication needs. Okay. So some social communication difficulties might look like difficulties using and understanding non-verbal communication. So that is that awareness of another person's feedback that they might be giving you when you're talking to them. So it could be their facial expression, looking confused or bored or excited, their personal space, or their tone of voice. Difficulties starting or finishing a sentence, waiting and turn taking in conversation, and difficulties seeing other people's points of view. I've got a lovely example. Recently, my daughter was reading a book about autism and she said, "Mummy, did you know that neurotypical people can guess what other people are feeling?" And I said, "Yeah, they can." And it blew her mind, even that possibility. So it's really important for us to think from the other side. And she had no idea that that was possible. Understanding abstract language and taking things literally. Yes, really, that can be a real difficulty, although it is something that can be learned, which we talk about a little bit. And difficulties with unstructured times or changes in routine, such as playtime or PEs, or Christmas. The run up to Christmas is a classic one that could be tricky. And also difficulties processing language. So often neurodivergent children, and there can be a lot of demand and lots of input. So it's just being aware that they might need more time to fully understand and process what they're hearing.
Great. Thanks, Emily. So I'm going to talk a little bit about something called the double empathy problem. So in the past decade or so, various researchers, and we've named some of them on the screen, have examined and talked about something they've called the double empathy problem in autism. And it's helped us understand more broadly that difficulty communicating with a neurodivergent person is not a one-way issue. It is a wider problem of a lacking mutual understanding between a neurotypical and neurodivergent person. In fact, there's really good evidence that neurodivergent people can communicate really well when they are together. So they can feel more comfortable and share more about themselves and develop a better sense of rapport with other neurodivergent people in conversation. So I'll use an example to talk through this double empathy problem. So if we have a neurotypical child, so let's call this girl on the left here Alex, and Alex approaches an autistic child, let's call him Jay, he's on the right of the screen. Alex approaches Jay in the playground and she's smiling at him and she shouts loudly, "You're a baddie and I'm taking you prisoner." Now, because Jay is autistic, he might not link the smiling expression with the verbal content to understand that Alex is trying to initiate a fun imaginary game with him to play. In fact, some autistic children find imaginary play really quite difficult and confusing. So therefore, Jay might be feeling quite frightened, someone shouting at him and calling him a nasty name. And he might not know how to communicate this fear or confusion. So he just says, "I'm not a baddie, go away." Now, Alex may not understand Jay's feelings or how to communicate with an autistic child, so she might pull on his arm to try again to initiate play together. But Jay is unfortunately very sensitive to touch and especially does not like unexpected touch. So he begins screaming and crying, and sadly, Alex runs away and doesn't try and play with Jay again. So in this example, we can see how it was a lack of understanding from both Alex, who is neurotypical, and Jay, who's neurodivergent, in this interaction that sadly resulted in an attempt at play being abandoned and not repeated again. So it's really important to keep in mind that when communication is difficult between neurotypical and neurodivergent people, there is a two-way reciprocal problem going on with understanding and relating to one another. We shouldn't just focus on the difficulties of the neurodivergent person. So the neurotypical person, such as Alex, might be struggling to recognise and understand neurodivergence, to be clear in their meaning and intention with what they say. They might not understand sensory difficulties if that's not something they experience themselves. They might actually struggle to have a positive first impression of a neurodivergent person, perhaps due to negative assumptions or stereotypes. And also neurotypical people may not really tolerate social norms being broken and find that really challenging. Whereas on the other hand, a neurodivergent person, such as Jay, might struggle with reading between the lines in conversation. They might struggle understanding facial expressions, might really struggle communicating when they don't understand something, might struggle with managing sensory distress or distraction, and also might not follow those social norms that other people might expect. For example, maybe standing a bit closer than some people like in terms of personal space. So the point we're making here with the double empathy problem is that it is both people with different brains, with different cognitive skills, different interests, different experiences, who are struggling to understand each other and communicate. So thinking about that example we just gave, how might it feel for Jay or for another neurodivergent person, perhaps your own child? How might it feel to struggle to communicate with others or to feel misunderstood by others? You may be neurodivergent yourself and you may have your own direct experience you could speak to here, but if not, just have a think, how might Jay have been feeling? Frustrating, absolutely. Yeah, really upsetting and lonely, yeah. For Jay, that meant that Alex didn't try to play with him again, which is really sad. Feeling lonely, feeling bewildered, yeah, that's a really good word. Confusing, scared, yeah. If you're not understanding what people are meaning or feeling that you can't get your point across or be understood. Feeling unliked, yeah, overwhelmed, yeah. Not a positive experience at all, no, exactly. Feeling alienated, yeah, that's a really good point. Not wanting to be there, yeah. And we do see, unfortunately, lots of neurodivergent children sort of giving up on trying to kind of either make friendships or initiate social communication when they've had experiences like this of communication not going so well. Caused me a lot of anxiety when I was a child. Yeah, really anxiety provoking. Yeah, feel like giving up, feeling sad. Yeah. So we've got some themes coming up there. Lots of people talking about frustration. We've got anger, loneliness and isolation, and confusion and upset. Thank you, everyone. That's really helpful and really powerful, I think, to think about how that must feel. Okay. So we're going to have a bit of a think about behaviour as communication. So for children who struggle to communicate, they're likely using their behaviour to demonstrate a feeling, a need or a want. And behaviour that is perceived as challenging to other people is a child's way of communicating something important. Behaviour might be as a result of a stress response, so wanting to fight, so lash out, hurt themselves or others. Flight, which could be trying to run away from something or avoid something uncomfortable, or freeze, so trying to hide or refuse to move when something's feeling tricky. So if you've been to one of our workshops before, you may have seen this slide, but this slide just really demonstrates that when children struggle to identify and communicate their emotions, it can be really difficult to work out what's going on underneath the surface. So at the top of the iceberg here, we've got some of those behaviours that you might see, which is indicating that something's not right for your child, or they need something, or they want something. It might be avoiding things, it might be being irritable, perhaps hurting themselves or others. But with this iceberg analogy, we can see that below the surface of the water, there are endless things that could be going on for that young person. And lots of these things, like anger or fear or jealousy, can be really hard for neurodivergent children to understand and put into words how it is that they're feeling. So if your child's behaviour is concerning or is worrying you, it's important to think about what might be going on under the surface. What might they be struggling to communicate? And we had a whole workshop on this, on understanding and managing behaviour last year. So if you haven't seen that and would find it helpful, do have a look at that. Now, when emotions become overwhelming, it becomes even harder for a child to communicate how they are feeling and what they need. Just like Emily was saying with her daughter, lots of the time she can be really organised and really independent, but when things are overwhelming, things become much more challenging. So when we're trying to understand what's happening in our brains when we get overwhelmed by emotion, we wanted to go back to a model that we've talked about before by Dan Siegel, who's an American psychiatrist. And I will try and go through this quickly because I know we've talked about this in lots of our other workshops. Essentially, we can think of our brains as a house and having an upstairs and a downstairs part of the brain. The upstairs part of the brain is like the control tower. It's this amazing part of our brain right at the front called the prefrontal cortex. And that allows us to do all these wonderful skills like problem solving, reasoning, logic, planning, as well as regulating and engaging with our emotions so we feel we have a sense of control. Now, the downstairs part of our brain is our emotion center. It's our alarm system. It's home of a part of the brain called the amygdala, right in the deep center of the brain. And the responsibility of the downstairs brain is being the alarm system. And it keeps us safe from danger. And it triggers the fight, flight, or freeze response when it identifies something that we need to be alarmed about. And the reason it does this is so that it gives us the best chance of getting ourselves safe when we think there's danger around. And we really need this because it allows us to notice real danger and to motivate and get our body into action when there's something we need to do. But let's have a think about what Dan Siegel calls flipping your lid. So when we're feeling calm and relaxed, you could see on the slide before, the upstairs and downstairs brain are working really well together. They've got a stairs between the two and messages can pass back and forward and it's working really nicely. We can feel our emotions that our downstairs brain points out, but we're able to still use our thinking brain to make good decisions, to plan things, and often use language to explain what we're going to do or talk to people about what's happening. However, when big feelings like anxiety, fear, anger, when they become really overwhelming, often that downstairs brain can take charge. And what happens then is something we call flipping the lid. So that downstairs brain takes over and we lose access to the upstairs part of our brain. And this happens to adults as well as children. I'm sure we can all think of a time where we flipped our lid and our emotions have taken over. But what's happening in our brain when our emotions take over, when our downstairs brain has taken control, is that we no longer have access to the part of our brain that helps us make good decisions. So this is a real challenge. We call it flipping the lid because we've lost that sense of control over our emotions and making good plans about what to do next. So often when a young person's really upset or frustrated, we want them to be able to be rational and to settle down and to think about what to do next. But if your child's downstairs brain has taken over, they are not going to be able to reason with you or to talk about what's happening or to make a plan about what to do because they are too overwhelmed by those big emotions. So children really need help calming down and connecting with those around them before they can bring their thinking brain back online. So we need to calm down those emotions of the downstairs brain so that the thinking brain can come back online, and then you can think with your child about what to do next. So I won't go into loads of detail about how to do this because we did cover this in our Managing Big Feelings workshop. So we're moving on to masking, and then we're going to move on to some strategies. So many of you, I'm sure, have heard the term masking, but for those of you who haven't, Neurodivergent children may feel pressure to fit in, to be accepted by their peers or even maybe their family, and to not be criticised and humiliated. Therefore, they might try to hide or camouflage or mask the things that they find difficult or that they think are different about them. Examples of masking might be somebody making extra effort to try and make more eye contact than feels comfortable for them. They might be mimicking the behaviour or language used by other people around them to try and fit in. Or they might be actively trying to reduce some of their neurodivergent behaviours, such as stimming, because it doesn't feel that it fits with what other people are doing around them. And in autistic children, it's thought that girls in particular really try to mask their difficulties. And this is important to know because masking is absolutely exhausting and it can have a really negative impact on a young person's well-being and their self-esteem. And what we need to be careful of when we're thinking about supporting young people with their social communication is that we don't want to be introducing any approaches or interventions that are actually encouraging masking. We don't want to be teaching a child that they need to pretend to be something they're not, or they need to learn to be neurotypical. Again, we just want to stress the point. We're not trying to change how your child communicates. We're just here to offer some support and advice with particular difficulties that they might have and that they might want some help with. So I'll hand back over to Emily here.
Okay, so now we're moving on to looking at some strategies for supporting language and communication. And these are all the areas that we're going to give some advice on. So we're going to look at, here's the first one. Thank you, Annie. Yep, ready. So supporting comprehension. So these are just some top tips and they're quite generic, but they're also tailored specifically for supporting social communication. So you might be aware of some of them or many of them already. So slowing pace of talking. So this is the communication partner's pace of talking. So you're talking. So by slowing down how quickly you're talking, it really helps with your child's processing. And again, by chunking language into shorter amounts. So we're not giving lots and lots of language all in one go. It gives everyone in the conversation more time to think and process what's being said and understand it and then construct a response. So it's a really simple strategy that helps a lot. The next one here, giving time before repeating. Again, sometimes it can be helpful to give your child just a little bit longer before you help them, because it might be that they just need a few more seconds to process and respond. One strategy can be just to count to 10 in your head before you then help, which might be helpful. And then if you do need to repeat an instruction, it's really helpful to say the instruction exactly the same way or this question in exactly the same way, because if you change the way you've said it, which you might do because you want to try and make it easier to understand, it might actually mean that your child has to reprocess the whole sentence again, which might slow things down. Using clear language and explaining exactly what you mean. So this is avoiding metaphors and abstract concepts and idioms such as phrases like, can you give me a hand or pull your socks up? I mean, it's okay to use these phrases, but do it with an explanation. So, oh, can you give me a hand? You know, that means, can you help me? So that you're explaining to your child so that if you do have a child that is interpreting lots of language quite literally, it's not that they can't ever understand these words. It's more that they just need that extra explanation. And then most of the time, they'll probably remember the meaning next time. You can also help by putting idioms into context. So if someone else uses one, or if there's one in a book, you just give that extra context. When you start being aware of idioms and all these figures of speeches that we use in communication, it's quite mind-blowing. Well, there's one anyway, mind-blowing, because actually we use them all the time. And when you start thinking about it, you realize it must be a processing nightmare for our young people. And interestingly, they did a bit of research and they found that typical development of idioms goes up to about 13 years anyway. So even for neurotypical children, it's really helpful to explain every idiom and figure of speech that you're using, because we don't just learn them automatically. So it's a good habit to get into. Other phrases that you can avoid using are things like in a minute, or just a minute, unless it really means just a minute. I know my daughter really hates the word soon. She says, when are we going out? And I say soon. That one word really annoys her because it doesn't mean anything to her. And other phrases such as saying will you or can you can be a bit confusing unless your child has a choice. So the classic one is if you say, can you go and get ready for bed? By making it a question, your child can say no. But if you say go and get ready for bed, it's nice, clearer language. Saying things in order. So this is really helpful, especially if you think of how complex time concepts can be. So it's much better to say language in the order it's going to happen. It's much easier to process. So one example might be, you might say, first get in the car and then you can have your tablet. That's easier to understand than if you said, you can have your tablet, but first get in the car. It's a simple way of reordering it, but it makes a big difference for understanding. And finally here, being aware of multi-meaning words. So some words have more than one meaning. So words such as rich, so it could be rich, lots of money, or strong tasting food, or a word such as fair could mean equal, fair ground, fair skin. So the meaning really depends on the context and the situation. So often children may find these words harder to understand and therefore just need a bit more time processing or some clear teaching to understand the word. Okay, next slide. Oh, here we go. Using context to support and learning language. So I'm sure many of you do this already, but this is that how you teach about situations and behaviours as they happen. So it helps to give meaning and context. So any experience during the day, you can model the social response. So, oh, Joe has just given us a book, so we say thank you. All that modeling, and similarly mapping meaning onto actions. So it can be really useful to use commenting for actions. So instead of asking a child, what are you doing, you comment on what's happening. This is can be really useful in more stressful situations as well, where actually the demand of asking a question, what are you doing, might just be too much. So you can say things like, oh, you're smiling and laughing lots today. I think you might be excited because it's your birthday. So you're sort of commenting on what your child's experiencing. We shouldn't ever presume we know how children are feeling, but we can use our best knowledge. And that's also a nice way to help teach children to map their emotions onto their actual feelings and give them the emotion vocabulary as well. Don't assume understanding and generalization. Yeah, this is just to remind, like Annie was saying about masking, often our children are experts without even them realizing at looking like they know what's happening and what's happened. So you can just check back. Especially any situations that involve non-verbal communication or all those skills that we talked at the beginning being difficult, just checking back that your child really understood and if any explanations needed. And then finally here, having a conversation while doing a shared activity alongside your child. So some people find that talking face to face can be really challenging with their child because there's extra demands, such as a demand of feeling that you need to make eye contact or understanding nonverbal communication. So a really good way to support comprehension might be to just sit next to each other and to be having that conversation while you're doing something else, like whether it's baking or colouring or a puzzle or whatever it is you might be doing. Okay. This slide is looking at using visual supports. Now, visuals are so important for our neurodivergent community, really, in supporting and understanding expectations, routines, behaviour and communication. Using a visual timetable, such as some in the pictures here. So there's one going downwards from registration, maths, playtime, and then a written one, breakfast, brush teeth, get dressed, park. These are both examples of visual timetables, and they can make a child's day feel predictable and safe. And I'd say they are the key words here. And it doesn't matter what visual you're using. It might be a photo, it might be a picture, a line drawing, or even the written word. That's all visual support. And you can also use visuals to help explain concepts or and assist with any parts of comprehension. So on the screen also we've got timers up here. So timers can be really useful to show an ending, that an activity is about to end. When I've talked through the other two, and just from some personal experience, my daughter has a liquid timer that she uses for brushing her teeth. And that really helps her because she finds it's very motivating to look at the timer, and it's gets her brushing her teeth for the right amount of time. She's also made herself a visual support for understanding emotions. So she has used at her school, they use zones of regulation to teach emotions, and she's used her own version where she's used the colours of the rainbow, because that's one of her big sort of interests and routines, is to use the rainbow throughout her day and week. And she's sort of mapped her own emotions, and she just did this spontaneously herself, which was quite amazing. And then she moves like a bit of blue tack onto which one she's feeling that day. And that's been a really nice way that she's using that visual to be able to express how she's feeling in that time. Other things might be writing notes. I know personally, if my daughter's really overwhelmed, sometimes it really helps if we just write notes to each other rather than use verbal words. Again, that's using a visual, and it takes the language demand out of that communication. And this one sounds really simple, but it works every time. But if I'm doing a presentation for work, a sign on the door that says, "Do not disturb, mummy's doing training," is enough for her not to disturb, and it actually works. Like, there's something about the power of that visual. So which visual you use is really specific to your own child and their preferences and their learning style as well. And visuals often change and evolve as well. So that is absolutely fine. But I would say don't give up with them, because they are so helpful for understanding. And another visual that we have got, the other picture at the bottom there of the lady crying with a cup of tea, is relating to using comic strips and social stories, which is what we're going to talk about in April's training. So we haven't included that here, but that is another two really good visual aids to support understanding, specifically looking at relationships and social situations. Okay. All right. So these are some tips. So going back to when we were looking at questions earlier, these are some tips for supporting verbal reasoning, or some blank level tips. And this would be specific specifically if your child needs help answering questions in general, but also for those times where any questions might be tricky. So focusing on level 3 questions, if you do Google the blank level model, you'll get more examples of questions, or you can use the slide that we showed. Those questions really are tailored a lot to thinking and feeling, so they're a good place to start if that's an area that needs a bit of practice. Encouraging, just on that note, before I move on, remember to acknowledge your own child's viewpoint when you're looking at thinking and feeling, because like Annie was saying earlier, we don't want them to think that their way of thinking is wrong. So it's just more to have a discussion and help to support them in answering those questions. Encouraging answers outside your own experiences and perspectives. Remembering again that your child might say the right answer but not fully understand it. I get that quite a lot with my assessments, where you get a child who thinks they're saying what I want them to hear, if that makes sense. So it's sort of just digging a little bit deeper and checking understanding. Encouraging acting out. Some children love role play and acting out to check understanding. This can be really useful to find out that deeper level and to have a bit of practice, which is fun. Consider social problem solving. So thinking about joy meltdowns and breakdowns. So if you have a child that is struggling, you can think, is it that they're struggling with problem solving here? So it might be that you could put in a simple visual aid for problem solving. So when your child's calmer again, that might be something you can make together. When I feel like this, I can do this. So it might be that that's a reason for a meltdown that you can then support. And just being aware that the size of the problem might baffle neurotypical. And again, think about that double empathy theory and try not to underplay what your child might be getting upset about. You can just acknowledge it. This looks hard for you and you seem to be upset. So you're acknowledging and labeling. And then you can talk through solutions using a visual aid. And using choices and visual aids, which I just talked about, and don't assume generalization. So just checking back and for different areas, and just remembering really that questions can feel like demands for some children, and that can be really stressful at times. So reducing demands might sometimes mean reducing all language at all. So as a speech and language therapist, we don't rarely say stop talking, but in this training we do. It's the one time we stop talking and recommend it. Okay, next slide. So supporting social communication. So again, we've sort of mentioned this, but in the past, the approach was to try and get neurodivergent to fit neurotypical standards. So it might have been like trying to teach eye contact, but that's not the case anymore, thank goodness. And today, we are celebrating the difference in communication styles and providing support. So as we talked about throughout this workshop series, today's approach is really about celebration and not trying to change your child. And when we say specific challenges, we mean difficulties with communication that your child generally wants support with, because sometimes children are happy and they don't want any support with it, which is absolutely fine if that's what they want. It's just trying to give you the tools to help your child navigate friendships or help them navigate communication at school and understand social communication, or times where they might be confused, and communicating their emotions, which I think would be useful advice for all of us, really. So yeah. Okay, I think I'm passing back to Annie.
Great, thank you. So we've got another slido. We're going to move on to thinking a bit more specifically about communicating emotions, but we wanted to start with asking yourselves, what do you find helpful with helping your child communicate their emotions? So Emily's given some lovely examples of what works well for her and her family, and yeah, visuals and visual timetables, absolutely. Sign language, yeah.
Looks like people have been listening, which is great. Seeing those really good answers there.
Brilliant. Very straightforward language, absolutely. Talking when calm, that's a really, really good point. Draw on what has happened in the lead up to an outburst, yeah, so kind of reflecting on what's happened when calm. Zones of regulation at home, yeah. Using Makaton, yeah, so people are using some practical strategies of Makaton or sign language as well. Modeling, expressing my own emotions, absolutely, that was something I've got in my notes to mention in a slide or two. Drawings, absolutely. Visual aids, giving time, care and security, I think that's a lovely one. So helping your young person feel cared for and secure. Take them somewhere quieter to discuss, really, really good point. Creating a safe personal space they feel comfortable in. Lovely ideas. Okaying the feeling, I think that's a great one. Yeah, so just validating however your child is feeling is valid. That is how they are feeling. Make sure I communicate my own feelings clearly. Absolutely. Yeah. Safe spaces, arts and crafts, yeah, really, really useful for some young people. Yeah. Oh, some lovely, lovely examples of people talking about helping their child to become calm and then reflect on kind of communicating and thinking about what's happened afterwards. Show me and giving them my hand so they can use hand leading to communicate. Yeah, another great example. Lovely. Space Talk Watch has a facility to communicate feelings. I've not heard of that before. That sounds great. Talking better when outside walking, absolutely. So that's and I find that as well, actually, in therapy sessions with some young people, the kind of sitting face to face and trying to talk about difficult emotions can be really challenging. So doing a shared activity where we're kind of side by side or kind of not directly looking at each other can really help some children to open up. So sitting and doing some drawing or playing with toys, or even just sitting in a situation where you're not directly face to face with someone, that can really help children to talk. Lovely. Brilliant. Thank you so much, everyone. We're going to cover some of this, but we've got some lovely ideas here as well. Brilliant. Okay. So if any of you came to our Big Feelings workshop, you might recognise this slide. But this slide is really just thinking about building emotional literacy. And for some children, they may need some additional kind of teaching or specific advice around understanding emotions and how to communicate them. And there are loads and loads of resources out there to support families with this. We've already talked about using visuals and how helpful that can be. There are games online, such as this Sesame Street one called Name That Emotion. The Inside Out film is fantastic for learning about emotions. And you may have your own kind of games or things that you use or books that you already have to learn about emotions, particularly things like learning to match facial expressions with different emotions or helping your child to learn what different feelings in their body mean in terms of different emotions. And other visuals you can use, there are things like emotion wheels, like what we've got on the screen. So it can be hard for a child to just kind of pick a word of an emotion that they're feeling, but if they can look at an array of different emotions and faces, that might help them to kind of minimize the demand of having to come up with those emotion words. They can just pick one that they think matches the best. And thermometers can be helpful as well. So asking your child to kind of rate that intensity of the feeling that they've got. And it might be that your child can rate just how good or bad they are feeling on a thermometer. Or they might be able to say, I'm feeling worried, and you can use a thermometer to kind of judge how worried are you feeling? You know, is that really, really intense worry, or is that just feeling a little bit worried? There are lots of toys that are available as well, kind of squishy toys that have different faces on that a child can turn to a different face based on how they are feeling. Something that works quite well for children and for teenagers actually is using emojis or using texting. So Emily said that note writing can be helpful for her daughter, but also it might be easier for your child to text you or to put on a screen or a tablet that they use an emoji of how they are feeling on that day. And they might like to do that at the start of the day and the end of every day. So you can judge kind of where they're at without them needing to verbally tell you, this is what's going on and this is how I'm feeling. And like with any new skill or getting better at a skill, practice makes perfect. So take all the opportunities that you can to recognise emotions for your child and doing that kind of commenting and communicating what's going on. So lots of people on the previous slide were talking about naming their own emotions, which is really, really helpful. So taking opportunities to say something like, I'm feeling a bit stressed about this, or, oh, I'm feeling surprised, I wasn't expecting that to happen. That's great. And also just to point out, schools might be able to help with this. So some schools might have access to specialist teachers called Emotional Literacy Support Assistants, or ELSAs, and they can provide support for young people in terms of learning more about their emotions. And just to mention that films and TV also offer really great opportunities to learn about social relationships and communication. I know a few people mentioned this on the Slido. In real life, unfortunately, there's no pause and rewind buttons, but films and TV do offer us that opportunity to learn a bit more about communication. So you can use the pause and rewind button, or even just comment as the film or TV goes along, commenting on what's happening, maybe what the characters are saying, what they might be thinking and feeling, and maybe what might happen next. You can chunk films into kind of smaller sections if that's more manageable for your child, so you can still follow along the story in a film, but over a few kind of sittings. And you can prompt your child to think about clues to what might be going on, either in the social situation or in terms of a character's emotion. So you could say something like, watch his face. Do you think it could be telling us something about how he feels? What might he be feeling? And if your child is finding it difficult to make sense of what's going on, you can do some of that modelling or using your own ideas. So you could say, I think he might be feeling worried because he can't find his friend. So that may be something that you're already using. We've got an example here from one of Emily's colleagues. I think this is the moment that Charlie finds the golden ticket in Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, and he's bringing it to show his grandpa. So in the corner there on the left, it says what happened, and it said Charlie has got the last ticket and he brings it home. And there's some kind of speech bubbles that have been added in there of what Charlie might be thinking. So he might be thinking, I'm so excited, they won't believe it. And his grandpa might be thinking, I've just woken up from a nap. What is he on about? This can't be true. And then thinking about the look on the grandpa's face. What might he be feeling? Maybe confused, maybe surprised, but also becoming quite excited. So we've got some tips here on masking, and I will hand over to Emily for this one.
This is just a few tips, and we do have a signpost link to a book where most of these are from at the very end. So this to give your child space and encouragement to explore their strengths, allowing your child to use stimming when they need to, helping your child to understand and talk about emotions, showing compassion for your child's differences and difficulties, and avoiding making judgments, and really sharing your understanding with school. And I think that's a really big one here, because school often, they don't pick up, even the best well-meaning schools don't pick up on what's really going on for your child. And whether school might have a trusted adult that your child could talk to. We've got some resources at the end, like I mentioned, to share. And just as a side note, I recently watched the adapted book by Elle McNichol, Kind of Spark, which is on BBC iPlayer, and I would really recommend it for grown-ups and children over about, I don't know, 8, I suppose. They deal with issues such as masking and also burnout, and the main characters are lovely neurodivergent role models. So yeah, that's a very accessible way to learn a bit more about masking, I would say. And yeah, we have another Slido. So how have you helped others understand your child's unique strengths and challenges? Just explain to them as much as possible. Yeah. One-to-one talks with school. I think this is, oh, what is stimming? We can explain that. Shall we? So stimming is often repetitive movements or sounds or noises. I don't know if I'm giving the best description, that a child finds. It's basically, in the past, people might have tried to tell children to stop doing it, but they are actually really important for releasing energy. I don't know if Annie wants to add any more. So it might be, you might have a child that flaps their hands or does sort of tapping with their hands or twiddling or spinning around. So it can be lots of different repetitive movements. What else have we got on here? Talking to and explaining, sharing articles from sources like the National Autistic Society, brilliant. Providing fidget toys, but explaining to a brother, that's a really tricky one sometimes, that sort of awareness for siblings. In meetings with school, explaining that he thinks differently to other children. Talking to their peer groups in school, that's a really good one. Using a communication book, we're going to go on to that in a moment. Sharing resources with family and friends. Making sure I'm heard. Someone had put that they're their child's voice, and I really think that's very true, actually. And sometimes I think we can feel a bit like we don't want to be that nagging parent, but remember, you're the advocate for your child, so keep going. Fighting his corner, social stories, which we'll come on to in the April training. Lots of really good, gave grandparents a book on autism. Great, brilliant, because things of knowledge has changed so much, so it's really good to explain to the older relatives in the family. I find it's difficult. Yes, there's an understand. Yeah, someone said they don't feel there's an understanding a lot of the time. Yeah, it is. It can be really difficult. I think most education settings are improving, but it's still, the environments are very difficult to be in just generally, and there aren't always easy solutions. But yeah, keep going. I say to their neurotypical sibling at bedtime, imagine how it felt to be your brother or sister today in whatever situation. I use as an example, and we discuss it. Oh, how lovely. It's wonderful. It's lovely ideas on here. Thank you very much, everyone. We're nearly at the end of our training. Thank you for bearing with us. If you can stay on a few more minutes. So being your child's champion. So on that note, we just really wanted to stress that communication difficulties for neurodivergent children often come from being misunderstood by others and not having the appropriate support that they need. And if a child's unique needs are better understood by everyone around them, they're much likely to find communication easier and reduce masking, which will then reduce other long-term mental health and anxiety. So by advocating for your child's unique strengths and challenges, and even with a school that has had lots of training on autism, your child is unique and there will be things that need to be done differently. It can really help others communicate better with your child. And on the next slide, these are some examples of some visual supports. I think someone said that they use a communication passport. A communication passport is a book all about your child, where you talk about things that they need, things that help them, their personal interests, and it can really bridge that gap between difficulties getting to know the true person that is coming to school and your child's individual strengths and needs. And a one-page profile is sort of a one-page version of that. So you could have both of these documents. And the idea of the one-page profile is it can just be up in a staff room or wherever is appropriate, and staff can just really quickly see what's important for that child, what helps, how to support them. And also, I know some schools use a sensory passport as well, which works in a similar way. So it might be that for your child, if there's specific sensory needs that help with which will then help with their communication, and they might not be able to communicate what they need themselves, you might want to put that onto a one-page profile as well. I think that's about it for those ones.
Great, thanks, Emily. That's brilliant. So we are onto the sort of resources and signposting and final Slido questions at the end. Thank you for sticking with us. If you can stick with us for a few minutes longer, that'd be brilliant. So we've got some of the resources here that we've been talking about and some additional resources. So we've got some websites that you might find helpful. I've got my list here. So the Social Thinking website and the Do to Learn website, they're both American websites. They've got lots of resources on supporting social communication, which are really helpful, and some advice for children on things like how to start a conversation, turn taking, that sort of thing. Helen Sanderson's website is the one with lots of person-centered resources, including some of those one-page profile templates, but you can also find other templates for those online. The Essex website is really nice on creating communication passports. And in Suffolk, our local autism diagnostic youth service, they have a lovely website with loads of resources on there, including some around language and communication and one-page profiles, but that's accessible to anyone. You don't need to live in Suffolk to access that website. A Kind of Spark is the programme that Emily was talking about on iPlayer. And then we've got a couple of books on the right, one on masking and one called Speak Up, which is a comic book style with a female autistic protagonist, and it's set in a high school. A couple of links to other learning and workshops if you're interested. So we've got that workshop that we ran on communicating with teenagers. We also ran one for teenagers about communicating with their parents and their family, which I think we called Getting What You Want from Conversations. So if your teenager would find that helpful, do point them in the direction of that recording. And there is some great online free training from the Kent Community Health Trust on selective mutism, which is a fantastic resource if that's something you'd find interesting. And then just a couple of Suffolk specific things. If you have got any concerns around emotional well-being or you want some advice around your child, you can call the Bernardo's phone line and the number is there on the screen. And also there's a link there to the local paediatric speech and language therapy service, and there's information on there about how to access specialist support if you think that that's something that you need.